She wasn't supposed to be remembered. In the beginning, she was just a girl who slipped into another man's house because her mother married again. But the story that grew from that arrangement, the story of a stepdaughter who became a bride, is one of the most disturbing, most hidden truths ever buried in American soil. When you first hear it, it sounds like gossip, the kind of whisper you dismiss. But if you follow it to the end, if you peel back the layers of family ties twisted into knots of lust and blood, you see something far more terrifying. You see how love curdles into possession, and how possession breeds inbreeding. The house where she lived never forgot her. The neighbors, if they spoke at all, only muttered. They knew the smell of sin when it hung in the air. They knew a father should never claim his wife's daughter, but silence was easier, silence was safer. In those days, family was not to be questioned, and so, behind closed doors, the stepdaughter grew into something else entirely, an heir not of hope, but of bloodline collapse. Historians rarely write her name. It appears in fragments, court records, diaries, the brittle notes of social workers who stepped too close and recoiled. She was, by all appearances, ordinary. A pale face, dark eyes, quiet demeanor. But when people looked at her long enough, they saw a strange reflection, something too close, too familiar. She had her stepfather's mannerisms, his gestures, even his speech patterns. That's when the whispers began. There is a reason her story is told in shadows. It carries with it the kind of shame no family wants unearthed. And yet this woman, this most inbred woman, was not only a product of her stepfather's obsession, she was a reminder that in the dark corners of America, behind the pious sermons and Sunday dinners, families were breeding secrets so unnatural they should never have survived. And yet, they did. Her childhood ended the moment her mother brought him home. He wasn't her father by blood, but he carried himself as though he had earned that right simply by wedding her mother. At first he was distant, even cold. But over time, the distance changed. The coldness softened into something else. Attention. Too much attention. He lingered when she entered a room. His eyes followed her. His words, at first parental, soon dripped with something unspoken, something that made her skin crawl even as she tried to dismiss it as her imagination. The house became a stage for a performance only the three of them knew. Her mother, fragile, exhausted, clinging to the hope that a new husband meant stability, saw nothing, or perhaps she chose not to see. It's hard to say whether blindness was her shield or her punishment. For the girl, though, there was no shield. Every step she took inside those walls was watched, measured, weighed, and when the mother fell ill, as she eventually did, the balance of power tipped completely. He began to speak to her as though she were already his. He told her stories of destiny, of keeping family close, of love that was stronger than the world outside. He convinced her that neighbors would never understand, that outsiders were poison. His words painted the world as hostile and himself as her only refuge. And slowly, as the months turned into years, she stopped fighting. By the time she reached womanhood, there was no distinction between stepdaughter and wife. The line had blurred until it disappeared. She belonged to him in name, in body, in blood. Their union was not celebrated, it was hidden. A paper marriage with no wedding bells, no church, no photographs, just the echo of a vow spoken in whispers, a vow that cemented not just their relationship, but the haunting legacy that would follow. What began as guardianship became possession. What began as protection became violation, and out of that violation came something darker still. Children born of confusion, children born with shadows stitched into their very veins. And the world outside, it kept silent. The children carried the truth in their faces. Neighbors would look at them and then look away too quickly, too nervously. There was something uncanny about them, as if the blood in their veins had been folded back on itself. Some had eyes too close together, others with jaws that never quite aligned, and one, they said, who never spoke a single word. But worse than their features was the feeling they gave off. a quiet, unsettling familiarity that made strangers uneasy, as though the children weren't entirely new, but echoes of someone already known. Whispers spread through the town, though never loud enough to stir action. Families told their children not to play too close. Mothers pulled their daughters away when the family passed by, but no one intervened. It was easier to pretend the union was simply strange rather than unnatural. The stepfather cloaked the family in isolation, telling the children that outsiders were cruel, that they must only trust their blood. And so, the cycle deepened. What's most haunting is how ordinary their life seemed on the surface. A wooden house, a dinner table, chores in the yard. But underneath it all was a truth that could not be spoken aloud. The children were both the heirs and the victims of a union that should never have existed. They were living testaments to the collapse of boundaries, to a love that had rotted into obsession, and to a mother who had long vanished from the story, buried in the silence of her own neglect. As the years stretched on, the family became a spectacle that no one wanted to acknowledge. The children grew, and with them, the rumors. Some claimed the line continued, that sons and daughters were paired off again within the family. Others insisted the bloodline was cursed, that the children carried afflictions too heavy to survive adulthood. But the truth, as always, lies somewhere between the gossip and the silence. What we do know is this. She, the stepdaughter who became his bride, lived long enough to see her children struggle with the burden she had carried herself. She saw the cycle reflected in their faces, and yet she never broke it. Perhaps she believed the lies he whispered, or perhaps by then she was too deep inside the web to ever find her way out. By the time her story reached outsiders, social workers, county officials, the rare journalist who dared to ask questions, it was already too late. The damage was sealed into the bloodline, stitched into the generations that followed. But the reports that survive, yellowed and fragile, read like dispatches from another world. They describe a family that spoke in half-finished sentences, children who clung too tightly to one another, and a matriarch who seemed both victim and conspirator, her silence as damning as his control. One investigator wrote that entering the house felt like stepping into a closed system, a world cut off from time itself. The windows were covered, the air was heavy, and though the children answered questions, their eyes often darted toward him, toward the man they called father, husband, protector, jailer. Every answer seemed rehearsed, as though the family lived inside a script they dared not abandon. The officials tried once or twice to intervene, but laws are written in black and white, while families like this one live in the shadows between. She was no longer a child when she married him, and so, on paper, there was nothing to prosecute. The children, though strange, were fed and clothed. The home, though unsettling, was orderly. To outsiders, it seemed like an odd family with odd habits. To those who looked deeper, it was a collapse of boundaries so profound it threatened to erase what it meant to be a family at all. What haunted the investigators most wasn't what they saw. It was what they couldn't. The unspoken moments. The way the stepdaughter, now wife, stood behind him, her expression unreadable. The way her hands trembled when she reached for the children. The way her silence seemed like a confession, though she never spoke a word against him. And so, like the neighbors before them, most turned away. They filed their reports, stamped, ped them closed, and moved on to cases less suffocating. She remained in that house. He remained in control. The children remained bound to a fate none of them chose, and the story sank back into the soil, into whispers, into the archives where it was never meant to be found again. The deeper you trace her story, the more it begins to feel like a curse passed hand to hand. Every choice that should have been hers was stolen, reshaped by the man who claimed her. And yet, there is something even darker, because history suggests the cycle didn't end with her. Some of her children grew, and when they did, the lines blurred once more. Brothers and sisters too close to separate. Cousins who weren't really cousins at all. Blood folded back onto itself like a snake devouring its own tail. The locals knew. They saw enough to understand without ever asking questions. In small towns, silence can be as thick as scripture. And so the family lived on, generation after generation, hidden in plain sight. Some say the children bore the weight of deformities, jaws too tight, spines twisted, minds trapped in fog. Others say that was only rumor, a punishment invented by outsiders to explain the unnatural. But the photographs that survive, the few that escaped destruction, speak for themselves. Faces that look too similar, eyes that belong not to siblings but to mirrors. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you break the silence, or would you carry the secret into the grave? Because she didn't break it, she lived her life inside the prison he built, a prison with walls made not of bricks, but of vows. And when she died, her children carried both her name and her shame. What haunts most is not only the union itself, but the way it was allowed to survive. How neighbors turned away, how officials shrugged, how silence became the accomplice. The story forces us to confront something we would rather bury. That family, the very institution meant to protect us, can sometimes become the darkest trap of all. And when it does, it doesn't just ruin one life, it poisons generations. By the time her grandchildren were born, the family's blood was already heavy with repetition. They carried the same features, the same haunted silence. Some spoke of illnesses that lingered in every branch, hearts that failed too early, minds that slipped into confusion long before age should have allowed it. Others carried something harder to name, a kind of inwardness, as if they knew the world outside their family was dangerous, foreign, untrustworthy. It wasn't taught to them. It was inherited, like a wound carried in the marrow. Generations blurred together until it was impossible to tell where one began and another ended. Photographs reveal faces almost indistinguishable. Mothers who looked like their daughters, fathers who could have been brothers, children who seemed to wear the same expression across decades. To the untrained eye, it was simply a family resemblance, but those who knew, those who whispered, understood what they were seeing. Not resemblance, but repetition, not heritage, but collapse. The most chilling part of her story is not that she became his bride, it is that she stayed, that the family continued long after the first whispers, that bloodlines once tangled rarely untangle themselves. People like to imagine that curses can be broken with willpower alone, but history shows us something colder. When power is abused, when silence is enforced, when families collapse inward, the damage is rarely undone. It ripples outward, down through the generations, long after the first sin is buried. And so, when we speak of her today, we do not speak of her alone. We speak of all who came after her, children and grandchildren who bore scars they never chose. We speak of the way an entire bloodline became a cautionary tale, hidden from textbooks, but alive in whispers. We speak of the most inbred woman not as a solitary figure, but as the root of a tree that twisted in on itself until it could no longer grow straight. Her story does not end with her death. In many ways, it never ends at all. It lingers in the soil, in the half-forgotten records of county clerks, in the hushed warnings parents gave their children. Stay away from that family. It lingers in the unease of neighbors who carried the guilt of silence, who knew what was happening but chose to look away. And it lingers in the faces of her descendants, some of whom still walk among us, carrying the echo of a union that never should have been. What chills us most is not the grotesque details, but the ordinariness of it all. This was not a Gothic castle or a backwoods legend. This was America, a quiet house on a quiet road where no one stopped to ask questions. And that is what makes the story unbearable. It could have been any house in any town. The horror was not foreign. It was domestic. It was family. She became his stepdaughter, then his bride, then the mother of his children. And in doing so, she became a symbol of something larger, something we rarely admit aloud, that the darkest monsters are not strangers in the night, but those who live within the walls we call home. Her life reminds us that the bonds of family, when twisted, can become chains, and once those chains tighten, it is almost impossible to break them. Today, when we remember her, we remember not a woman of strength or defiance, but a woman consumed by silence, a woman whose story was buried because it was easier to forget than to face. But forgetting does not erase. The past always lingers, waiting to be unearthed, waiting to be spoken again. So we speak her story now, not to exploit, but to remind, not to gawk, but to warn. Because if there is one truth to be learned from the most inbred woman, it is this: silence is the accomplice of horror, and history, no matter how deep you bury it, always claws its way back to the surface.